Some people spend their entire lives waiting for someone to see their worth. For Elira, that wait had stretched across 40 years of silent servitude in a vampire's castle. She cleaned blood from stone floors and tended to a master who barely acknowledged her existence. Day after day, she accepted that this was all her life would ever be. Then everything changed during a rare solar ritual when deadly sunlight broke through the castle walls. The alpha vampire, who had ruled for centuries, was about to be destroyed. Without thinking, Elira threw herself between him and the killing light. Her sacrifice saved his life, and ancient magic forced him to grant her 3 wishes. He expected her to ask for freedom or revenge. Instead, her first wish was something so simple it left him speechless. What could possibly shake an immortal creature who had seen everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Elira arrived at Castle Ravencrest, she was 7 years old and small enough to hide behind her mother's worn traveling dress. That was 33 years ago, though the memory remained as sharp as winter wind cutting through the mountain passes that surrounded this ancient stronghold. She had been born in the village below, where her mother worked as a seamstress until the fever took her life and left Elira with nowhere else to go. The blood chalice of binding sat in the great hall's center, its ornate silver surface reflecting candlelight like captured stars. Even as a child, Elira had understood its significance. This was where contracts were sealed, where fates were decided, where the powerful determined the course of lesser lives. She had watched from shadowed corners as Lord Castellan used it to bind servants, guards, and visiting dignitaries to their agreements. The chalice never lied, never broke its word, and never showed mercy. Castle Ravencrest stretched across the mountaintop like a sleeping dragon carved from black stone. Its towers pierced the sky, each one topped with gargoyles that seemed to watch the valleys below with hungry eyes. The main keep rose 7 stories, its windows narrow and barred, designed more for defense than comfort. Gothic arches supported corridors that echoed with footsteps, whispered conversations, and occasionally screams that no one discussed the next morning. Lord Castellan, though Elira had learned his true name, only recently ruled from the highest tower. His chambers occupied the entire 7th floor, accessible only by a spiraling staircase that servants climbed with trepidation. He was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet when he stood at full height, with dark hair that had not changed length or color in all the years Elira had served. His eyes held the weight of centuries, shifting from deep brown to amber, depending on his mood or hunger. When he smiled, which was rare, his canine teeth showed just enough to remind everyone of his true nature. The vampire lord conducted his business with the efficiency of someone who had outlived kingdoms. He received reports from his network of informants, managed trade agreements with neighboring territories, and maintained the delicate balance between the mortal world and the supernatural realm that existed within his domain. Merchants brought goods from distant lands, always arriving before sunset and departing before dawn. They never asked questions about their host's unusual schedule, and in return, they enjoyed protection on the dangerous mountain roads. Elira's daily routine had remained unchanged for decades. She rose before dawn to light the fires in rooms that never quite felt warm. The castle's stones held cold like a secret, releasing it slowly throughout the day, no matter how many logs burned in the great fireplaces. She prepared meals for the dozen human servants who maintained the castle during daylight hours, though Lord Castellan himself never ate food prepared in any kitchen. Her most important duty came at sunset, when she climbed the 7 flights to prepare the vampire lord's chambers. She filled his washing basin with water heated over the kitchen fires, laid out fresh clothing selected from his extensive wardrobe, and ensured his private study contained everything needed for the evening's work. Papers, quills, ink, maps, ledgers, the tools of governance that never changed regardless of the century. The other servants included Marcus, the head groundskeeper, who tended the castle's extensive gardens and supervised the stable hands. His hands were permanently stained with soil, and he spoke with the careful precision of someone who had learned to choose his words wisely. There was Helena, the head cook, whose meals could make visitors forget they were dining in a vampire's stronghold. She had arrived 20 years ago as a young widow and had never spoken of leaving. Thomas served as captain of the castle guard, commanding a force of 12 men who patrolled the walls and gates. They were all experienced fighters, chosen for their loyalty and their ability to keep their mouths closed about unusual happenings. Some had served for decades, growing old in Lord Castellan's service, while their master remained unchanged. Others were newer, recommended by trusted allies or recruited from among discharged soldiers seeking steady employment. The most mysterious resident was Aldrich, an elderly man who appeared sometime during Elira's second decade at the castle. He claimed to be a scholar researching ancient history, and Lord Castellan had granted him residence in exchange for maintaining the castle's extensive library. Aldrich spent his days organizing centuries of accumulated books, scrolls, and documents. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of deep knowledge and careful observation. Within the castle's hierarchy, Elira occupied the lowest position. She was neither guard nor cook, neither scholar nor administrator. She was simply present, performing the tasks that others found beneath their station or too intimate for comfort. She cleaned blood from the Lord's chambers after his monthly feedings, never asking where it came from or how it was obtained. She washed clothing that sometimes bore stains, requiring special attention. She organized personal effects that revealed glimpses of a life spanning centuries. The vampire society that existed beyond the castle walls remained largely invisible to mortal eyes, but Elira had glimpsed it through overheard conversations and occasional visitors. Lord Castellan ruled a territory that extended far beyond the mountain valley, encompassing smaller towns, hidden sanctuaries, and networks of lesser vampires who owed him allegiance. This shadow kingdom operated according to laws and customs that predated human memory, governed by traditions that valued power, bloodline, and absolute hierarchy. Every 50 years, the celestial alignment created conditions for the solar ritual, a ceremony that allowed vampires to harness daylight magic without being destroyed by it. The ritual required precise timing, specific artifacts, and careful preparation. Lord Castellan had participated in this ceremony for over 400 years, using it to renew his powers and strengthen his connection to the supernatural forces that sustained his immortal existence. As the next solar ritual approached, Elira noticed changes in the castle's daily routine. Servants worked longer hours, preparing chambers that had not been used in decades. Ancient artifacts were retrieved from deep storage and carefully cleaned. Maps were updated, and messages were sent to allies across the territory. The upcoming ceremony would bring visitors of significant importance, vampires whose age and power commanded respect even from Lord Castellan. During the quiet moments in her daily work, Elira allowed herself to remember her mother's voice. The lullabies came back to her most often in the evening hours, when shadows grew long and the castle settled into its nighttime rhythms. Her mother had possessed a beautiful singing voice, clear and strong despite their poverty. She had sung of distant places, of love that conquered darkness, of heroes who protected the innocent. Those songs had been Elira's first education in hope, though hope had become a luxury she could rarely afford. The castle's atmosphere grew heavier as the solar ritual drew near. Lord Castellan spent longer hours in his study, reviewing preparations and consulting ancient texts. He spoke less during their brief interactions, responding to her reports and requests with single words or simple gestures. The weight of responsibility and tradition seemed to press down on him more heavily than usual, though Elira had never dared to comment on his moods or concerns. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his state of mind. When he paced the length of his chambers, she knew he was wrestling with complex decisions. When he stood motionless at his window for extended periods, he was remembering something from his distant past. When his responses became even more minimal than usual, she understood he was preparing for significant challenges that required his complete focus. The solar ritual represented both renewal and vulnerability. For vampires, daylight was typically deadly, but during the celestial alignment, it became a source of power that could strengthen their immortal existence. The process required exposing themselves to carefully controlled sunlight while protected by ancient magic and specific artifacts. One mistake, one miscalculation, could result in complete destruction. As Elira prepared for what might be the most significant day in decades, she carried her mother's memory like a precious stone, worn smooth by handling. The upcoming ritual would bring changes to Castle Ravencrest. She could sense it in the air, in the way shadows seemed darker and silences stretched longer. Whatever happened during the ceremony would alter the careful balance that had governed her life for 33 years. She had no way of knowing that her own actions would become the catalyst for transformations that reached far beyond anything the solar ritual itself could accomplish. The quiet slave maiden who had spent decades making herself invisible was about to step forward into a moment that would change not only her own fate, but the destiny of the immortal lord she had served in silence for most of her adult life. The solar prism arrived 3 days before the ritual, carried by a delegation of vampires whose age and authority made even Lord Castellan show deference. The crystalline artifact stood nearly 3 feet tall, its faceted surface catching and bending light in ways that seemed to defy natural law. When sunlight touched its edges, rainbow patterns danced across the walls like living things, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Elira watched from the servants' gallery as the delegation performed the consecration ceremony in the great hall. The vampires moved with fluid grace, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to resonate in her bones. The solar prism responded to their chanting, its inner light growing brighter until she had to shield her eyes from its brilliance. This was the artifact that would amplify the celestial alignment, allowing Lord Castellan to harness daylight without being destroyed by it. The preparation consumed the entire castle. Every servant worked from dawn to dusk, cleaning chambers that had remained sealed for 50 years, polishing silver until it gleamed like captured moonlight, and arranging furnishings according to precise specifications handed down through centuries of tradition. The ritual chamber atop the highest tower required the most careful attention. Ancient symbols carved into the stone floor had to be traced with powdered silver, and protective circles needed to be drawn with mathematical precision. Marcus supervised the placement of mirrors throughout the tower, each one angled to direct sunlight toward the solar prism at the moment of alignment. The calculation required had taken scholars decades to perfect, accounting for the castle's position, the mountain's elevation, and the exact trajectory of the sun during the rare celestial event. One mirror positioned incorrectly could disrupt the entire ceremony, potentially with fatal consequences. Helena worked around the clock, preparing foods for the visiting vampire's mortal servants and ensuring the castle's wine cellars were stocked with appropriate refreshments. The vampire guests required different accommodations than mortal visitors, including chambers that could be sealed completely against accidental exposure to daylight and furnishings that had never been touched by silver. Thomas doubled the guard rotations and established new security protocols. The solar ritual attracted attention from forces that opposed vampire society, and the ceremony's timing was known to enemies who might attempt disruption. He positioned archers on the walls, placed sentries at strategic points throughout the mountain passes, and coordinated with Lord Castellan's network of informants to monitor for unusual activity in the surrounding territories. Aldrich emerged from the library, carrying armloads of ancient texts, his scholarly demeanor replaced by urgent focus. He consulted charts that mapped celestial movements across centuries, verified the accuracy of ritual components, and advised Lord Castellan on the specific timing requirements that would determine success or failure. The margin for error was measured in seconds, not minutes. As the ceremony approached, Elira noticed changes in Lord Castellan's behavior that went beyond his usual pre-ritual preparation. He spent long hours standing at his chamber window, staring at the horizon with an expression she had never seen before. When she brought his evening reports, he would sometimes start to speak, then stop himself, as if wrestling with thoughts he could not quite articulate. On the morning of the ritual, she climbed to his chambers as usual, but found him already dressed in ceremonial robes of deep crimson silk. The fabric was embroidered with symbols that seemed to shift in the candlelight, and silver thread-traced patterns that hurt her eyes when she looked directly at them. He turned when she entered, and she saw something in his expression that she had never witnessed in 3 decades of service uncertainty. "The ceremony begins at midday," he said, his voice carrying undertones she could not identify. "I will not require your services until evening, assuming." He stopped himself, looked toward the window where morning light was growing stronger. "You have served well, Elira. Whatever happens today, remember that." She curtsied as she always did, but something in his words made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. In 33 years, he had never acknowledged her service directly, never spoken her name with anything approaching warmth. The change unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The ritual began precisely at the moment when the sun reached its zenith. From her position in the servants' quarters, Elira could hear the chanting that echoed from the tower above. The voices rose and fell in patterns that seemed older than language, calling upon forces that predated human civilization. The solar prism responded to their invocation, its light visible even from the lower floors as it painted the castle walls with shifting colors. She tried to focus on her daily tasks, but the energy building in the tower above made concentration impossible. The very air seemed to vibrate with power, and every piece of metal in the castle hummed with sympathetic resonance. Dishes rattled on their shelves, and the flames in the fireplaces flickered despite the absence of any wind. Then something went wrong. The sound came first, a crack like thunder, but sharper, more focused. It echoed through the castle with enough force to rattle the windows and send servants scrambling for cover. The chanting from the tower stopped abruptly, replaced by shouts of alarm and the sound of running feet. Elira abandoned her work and rushed toward the spiral staircase, driven by an instinct she could not explain. Other servants called after her, warning her to stay away from the tower, but she ignored them. Something inside her chest pulled her upward, a compulsion stronger than fear or common sense. She climbed the 7 flights faster than she ever had before, her lungs burning by the time she reached the ritual chamber. The door stood open, and brilliant white light poured from within, not the controlled radiance of the solar prism, but raw sunlight that should have been impossible at this altitude and angle. Inside the chamber, chaos reigned. The protective mirrors had been shattered, their fragments scattered across the floor like fallen stars. The solar prism lay in pieces, its power unleashed without direction or control. Vampires pressed themselves against the walls, seeking any shadow that might protect them from the deadly illumination. At the chamber's center, Lord Castellan stood frozen in a beam of pure sunlight that streamed through a break in the tower's ceiling. Smoke rose from his ceremonial robes, and his skin began to blacken where the light touched it. His centuries of existence were about to end in seconds, destroyed by the very force he had tried to harness. Elira did not think. She did not weigh consequences or consider alternatives. She simply moved, throwing herself between her master and the killing light with the same instinct that might drive a mother to protect her child. The sunlight struck her instead, hot and bright against her skin. But she felt no pain, only the strange sensation of warmth spreading through her body like honey. The light faded as the celestial alignment passed, leaving the chamber in sudden, profound silence. Lord Castellan stared at her with an expression of complete shock, his amber eyes wide with disbelief. The other vampires whispered among themselves, their voices carrying undertones of awe and confusion. "You saved my life," he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised her. "You, immortal, sacrificed yourself to protect me." But she had not been destroyed by the sunlight. She stood before him unharmed, though her simple servant's dress now bore scorch marks that traced patterns similar to the embroidery on his ceremonial robes. Something had protected her, some force she did not understand but could feel moving through her blood like liquid starlight. The ancient magic that governed vampire society recognized what had occurred. Blood freely given to preserve life created bonds that transcended normal hierarchies and customs. The other vampires backed away as power gathered in the air around Lord Castellan and Elira, forming connections that would reshape both their destinies. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of mystical compulsion. The blood debt is acknowledged, the sacrifice is witnessed, 3 wishes are granted, bound by magic older than kingdoms. Choose carefully, for each wish will change us both in ways neither can foresee. Elira felt the truth of his words, settle into her bones like an oath carved in stone. She had saved his life, and ancient forces had taken notice. The quiet slave maiden who had spent decades invisible in the shadows suddenly found herself at the center of a magical contract that would determine the fate of them both. The ancient grimoire of souls rested on Lord Castellan's private desk, its leather binding worn smooth by centuries of handling. Elira had dusted around it countless times without understanding its significance, but now its presence filled the chamber with weight and possibility. The book contained spells that could bridge the gap between life and death, allowing communication with spirits who had passed beyond mortal reach. 3 days had passed since the ritual, and Elira still felt the magic humming in her blood like a half-remembered song. Lord Castellan had given her time to consider her first wish, but his patience was wearing thin. She could see it in the way he paced his chambers, in the sharp edge that crept into his voice when he spoke to other servants, in the tension that gathered around his shoulders like an invisible cloak. The other servants treated her differently now. Where once they had barely acknowledged her presence, now they stepped aside when she passed, offered respectful nods, and spoke to her with careful courtesy. Marcus brought her fresh flowers from the garden without being asked. Helena saved the choicest portions of meals for her plate. Thomas ensured she had safe passage through any area of the castle at any hour. But their deference felt hollow compared to the weight of decision that pressed down on her thoughts. 3 wishes. 3 opportunities to change her life, to claim what had been denied her for 4 decades, to reshape her destiny according to her own desires. She could ask for freedom, for wealth, for power, for revenge against those who had treated her as less than human. Yet every time she tried to formulate such requests, her mind returned to a memory from childhood. Her mother's voice, soft and melodious, singing lullabies that painted pictures of better worlds. Those songs had been her shelter during the hardest times, her comfort when grief threatened to overwhelm a 7-year-old heart, her connection to love that death had not been able to sever. She remembered the last time she had heard her mother's voice, clearly. It was during the fever, when illness had stolen most of her mother's strength, but left her need to comfort her daughter intact. The lullaby had been about a princess who found her way home by following the song of nightingales, and her mother's voice had grown weaker with each verse until it faded into silence forever. Elira stood at the window of her small chamber, looking out at the mountain peaks that surrounded the castle like ancient guardians. The evening star was rising, bright and steady, against the darkening sky. Her mother had taught her to make wishes on that star, though she had learned not to hope too much from wishes that never seemed to come true. But this was different. These wishes carried the weight of magical compulsion, bound by forces that could not be denied or ignored. Lord Castellan was required to fulfill whatever she asked, no matter how it might affect him personally. She held power over someone who had controlled her life for decades, and the reversal felt both intoxicating and terrifying. She climbed the spiral staircase to his chambers with slow, deliberate steps, her decision finally crystallized into certainty. He was waiting for her in his study, standing beside the desk where the grimoire lay open to pages covered with symbols that seemed to shift in the candlelight. When she entered, he turned to face her with an expression of barely controlled impatience. "You have considered long enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "The magical bond grows stronger with each passing hour. If you delay much longer, the wishes will begin to shape themselves according to your subconscious desires rather than your conscious choices." "I understand, my lord," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I have made my decision regarding the first wish." He moved closer, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, drawing strength from the memory of her mother's courage in the face of death. If a dying woman could find the fortitude to sing lullabies to comfort her child, then she could find the courage to speak her heart's deepest longing. "I wish," she said, the words coming out clear and strong, "to hear my mother's voice once more, to hear her sing the lullabies she sang when I was a child, using your power to reach beyond death and bring her words to me across the years that have passed since she left this world." Lord Castellan stared at her in complete silence for so long that she began to wonder if she had somehow broken the magical bond with an impossible request. His expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been disappointment, before settling into a look she could not interpret. "That is your wish?" he asked finally. "Not freedom from servitude, not wealth or power or revenge, not even knowledge of secrets that could change your life forever? You would use magic capable of reshaping reality to hear a dead woman's lullabies?" "Yes," she said simply. "That is my wish." He turned away from her, walking to the window, where moonlight painted silver patterns on the stone floor. She could see his reflection in the glass, his face showing an emotion she had never witnessed in all her years of service. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange quality, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to her. "In 4 centuries of existence, I have known wishes born from greed, from hatred, from desperation, from ambition. I have seen mortals use supernatural power to seek dominion over others, to accumulate treasures beyond counting, to destroy their enemies, to claim knowledge that was never meant for human minds. But you," he paused, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath he did not need, "you would use it for love, for memory, for connection to something that exists only in your heart." "My mother's voice was the most beautiful thing in my life," Elira said quietly. "When she died, I thought I had lost it forever. If your magic can bring it back, even for a moment, then that is worth more to me than any treasure or power you could offer." He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally turned back to her, she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. It was not pity or condescension, but rather a kind of recognition, as if she had revealed something about herself that he found both unexpected and profoundly moving. "The grimoire contains the necessary rituals," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "But such magic requires preparation. We will perform the summoning tomorrow evening, when the moon is dark and the veil between worlds grows thin. You should prepare yourself. Hearing the voices of the dead can be overwhelming, even when they speak with love." As she turned to leave his chambers, he called her name, causing her to pause at the threshold. When she looked back, he was holding the grimoire, his long fingers tracing the ancient symbols on its pages. "Elira," he said, and hearing him speak her name with such careful consideration made her heart beat faster. "What was your mother's name?" "Liana," she replied. Her name was Liana, and she had the voice of an angel. The moonstone pendant of memory hung from a silver chain around Lord Castellan's neck. its pale surface glowing with inner light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Elira had never seen him wear jewelry before, but the ancient artifact was essential for the ritual they would perform in his highest tower. The pendant could preserve and project memories, allowing the dead to speak through their loved ones' recollections. She spent the day in quiet preparation, bathing with herbs that Aldrich had selected from his collection of mystical components. The scholar had emerged from his library with books that predated written history, their pages filled with instructions for communing with spirits. He spoke little, but his careful attention to detail suggested he understood the profound nature of what they were attempting. The other servants watched her with a mixture of respect and concern. Helena prepared a special meal designed to strengthen her spirit for the supernatural encounter ahead, including bread baked with honey from bees that fed on mountain wildflowers and tea brewed from leaves that grew only in moonlight. Marcus brought white roses from the garden, their petals unmarked by thorns or blemish, to scatter around the ritual circle. As evening approached, Elira climbed to Lord Castellan's chambers, wearing her finest dress, a simple gown of deep blue wool that her mother had sewn during her final months of life. She had saved it for 33 years, wearing it only once each year on the anniversary of her mother's death. The fabric still held faint traces of lavender water, her mother's favorite scent. Lord Castellan was waiting for her in his private study, the grimoire open before him to pages that seemed to glow with their own illumination. The moonstone pendant cast shifting patterns of light across the ancient text, and she could feel power gathering in the air around them like static before a storm. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something in his expression that she had never witnessed before, uncertainty mixed with what might have been anticipation. "The ritual requires precise timing," he explained, his voice carrying undertones of careful concentration. "We must begin when the moon reaches its zenith, and we will have only a brief window in which to make contact with your mother's spirit. The dead do not linger long in our world, even when called by powerful magic. They climbed to the highest tower together, ascending stairs that few mortals had ever been permitted to use. The chamber at the summit was circular, its walls lined with windows that offered views of the entire mountain range. Ancient symbols had been carved into the stone floor centuries ago, their meanings known only to scholars who studied the deepest mysteries of life and death. Aldrich had prepared the space according to specifications found in texts that predated vampire society. White roses formed a perfect circle in the chamber's center, their petals glowing silver in the moonlight that streamed through the open windows. Candles placed at precise intervals provided additional illumination, their flames steady despite the mountain wind that whistled through the tower. Lord Castellan removed the moonstone pendant and placed it at the circle's center, where it began to pulse with increasing intensity. The light it cast was not harsh or blinding, but rather gentle and warm, like sunlight filtered through spring leaves. He gestured for Elira to take her place within the circle, then positioned himself opposite her, the pendant between them, like a bridge spanning the gap between their worlds. "Give me your hands," he said, extending his own across the space that separated them. When their fingers touched, she felt power flow between them, his ancient magic mixing with her mortal life force to create something entirely new. The moonstone responded to their connection, its glow intensifying until the entire chamber seemed filled with silver light. He began to speak in a language that predated human civilization, his voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to resonate in her bones. The words were beautiful, despite being incomprehensible, carrying meanings that bypassed her mind and spoke directly to her heart. The pendant grew brighter with each phrase, and she began to feel a presence stirring at the edges of her consciousness. Then she heard it faint at first, like an echo carried on distant wind, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Her mother's voice, clear and sweet, and exactly as she remembered it from childhood. The lullaby began with the same gentle melody that had comforted her through countless nights, painting pictures of princesses and kingdoms where love conquered darkness. Tears streamed down her face as the familiar words washed over her, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Her mother's voice carried all the love and warmth she remembered, unchanged by death or the passage of decades. The song spoke of nightingales that guided lost children home, of stars that watched over sleeping villages, of mothers whose love transcended even the grave. Lord Castellan's eyes remained fixed on her face throughout the ritual, and she saw something changing in his expression as he watched her reaction to hearing her mother's voice. The cold distance that had characterized his demeanor for centuries seemed to crack, revealing glimpses of something warmer beneath. His grip on her hands tightened, not with possessiveness, but with what felt remarkably like protective concern. The lullaby reached its crescendo, her mother's voice soaring with emotion as she sang about love that lasted beyond life itself. But mixed with the familiar melody were new words, as if Lyanna's spirit had been waiting 33 years to deliver a final message to her daughter. She spoke of pride in the woman Elira had become, of strength that had grown in silence, of a future filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "My sweet daughter," her mother's voice whispered as the song drew to a close, "you have learned to love without expecting love in return, to serve without seeking recognition, to hope without demanding fulfillment. These gifts will transform not only your life, but the life of one who has forgotten what it means to feel. Trust your heart, for it sees truth that eyes cannot perceive." The voice faded gradually, like music carried away on evening wind, leaving the chamber in profound silence. The moonstone pendant dimmed until only moonlight illuminated the space between them. Lord Castellan released her hands slowly, as if reluctant to break the connection that had made the miracle possible. Elira sat in stunned silence, her heart full to overflowing with emotions she could barely contain. She had heard her mother's voice again, had felt her love reaching across the years and through death itself to offer comfort and guidance. But more than that, she had seen something in Lord Castellan's face during the ritual that suggested the magic had affected him as profoundly as it had affected her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gentleness she had never heard before. That was... He paused, seeming to search for words that could encompass what they had experienced together. "I have performed many rituals in my centuries of existence, but I have never felt anything like that. Your mother's love was so strong, it filled this entire chamber." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving her back to me, even if only for a moment." He helped her to her feet with unusual care, and she noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he retrieved the moonstone pendant. Whatever he had experienced during the ritual had shaken something loose in his ancient heart, something that had been buried beneath centuries of cold control. The crown of thorns rested in Lord Castellan's private vault, its dark metal gleaming with an inner light that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the chamber's illumination. Elira had never seen the cursed circlet before, but she could feel its presence through the castle walls like a weight pressing against her consciousness. The crown bound him to his vampiric nature, ensuring that centuries of darkness would never be broken by momentary weakness or misguided compassion. 3 weeks had passed since the ritual that brought her mother's voice back to her, and the castle had settled into a new rhythm that acknowledged her changed status without quite understanding what that change meant. She still performed her daily duties, but now other servants sought her opinion on matters that had never required her input before. Lord Castellan spoke to her differently as well, his words carrying a consideration that had been absent from their previous interactions. But beneath the surface changes, deeper currents flowed with increasing turbulence. Lord Castellan spent hours standing at his chamber windows, staring at horizons he had observed for centuries, but seemed to be seeing with new eyes. He spoke less during their evening meetings, but when he did speak, his words carried weight and uncertainty that suggested profound internal struggle. The crown of thorns was calling to him more insistently, reminding him of obligations that predated his encounter with mortal compassion. Vampire society operated according to laws that valued power above all else, and his growing connection to a human servant violated principles that had governed his existence since the night in his transformation. The crown's influence whispered of duty, of hierarchy, of the natural order that placed immortal predators above mortal prey. Helena mentioned that he had stopped taking his monthly feeding, the ritual that sustained his immortal existence and maintained his connection to the supernatural forces that granted his power. Without regular blood consumption, vampires began to weaken, their abilities fading as their connection to darkness diminished. The change should have been concerning, but instead of weakness, Lord Castellan seemed to be experiencing something entirely different. Marcus reported seeing him in the garden during daylight hours, something that should have been impossible for a creature of his age and power. He stood in shadows cast by ancient trees, but he was closer to sunlight than any vampire should be able to tolerate. When questioned about these sightings, Lord Castellan offered no explanation, leaving his servants to wonder if witnessing Elira's sacrifice during the solar ritual had somehow changed his fundamental nature. Thomas expressed growing concern about messages arriving from the Vampire Council that governed supernatural society throughout the region. The letters came with increasing frequency, their wax seals bearing symbols that commanded immediate attention and absolute obedience. Lord Castellan read these communications in private, but his mood darkened noticeably after each delivery, and he spent longer periods in meditation that seemed more like internal warfare. Aldrich emerged from his library, carrying books that dealt with transformation magic, curses that could be modified, and ancient prophecies that spoke of vampires who might someday choose mortal life over immortal power. The scholar's research had taken on new urgency since the night Elira heard her mother's voice, as if that ritual had revealed possibilities that required immediate investigation. During one of their evening meetings, Lord Castellan revealed information about his past that she had never expected to hear. His transformation had occurred during a period of political upheaval, when kingdoms rose and fell like waves against rocky shores. He had been a knight in service to a king whose name history had forgotten, fighting wars that seemed important at the time, but had ultimately meant nothing. "I chose immortality to continue protecting those who could not protect themselves," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries-old regret. But vampire society had different expectations. Protection became domination, service became exploitation, honor became survival at any cost. "The crown ensures that I remember my obligations to darkness rather than to the light I once served." She listened without interrupting, understanding that he was sharing secrets that could change the fundamental nature of their relationship. The quiet slave maiden, who had spent decades invisible in shadows, was being trusted with knowledge that could reshape her understanding of the man she had served without question for most of her adult life. "Your mother's message during the ritual spoke of transformation," he continued, moving to the window where starlight painted silver patterns on the stone floor. "She said your heart sees truth that eyes cannot perceive." "What truth do you see when you look at me, Elira? What do you perceive that others miss?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it demanded honesty that could be dangerous for both of them. She had spent 33 years learning to hide her thoughts, to speak only when spoken to avoid drawing attention that might bring punishment or worse. But the magical bond between them seemed to encourage truth over safety. "I see someone who has forgotten who he used to be," she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking across thin ice. "You wear authority like armor, but underneath the weight of centuries, there are glimpses of the man you were before darkness claimed you. When you helped me hear my mother's voice, I saw compassion that you try to hide even from yourself." He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally turned back to her, His expression held vulnerability that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. The amber eyes that typically held the cold calculation of a predator now showed uncertainty, as if her words had touched something he had thought was safely buried beneath layers of immortal indifference. "The council grows impatient with my recent behavior," he admitted. "They question my fitness to rule this territory, my commitment to vampire law, my willingness to maintain the hierarchy that keeps our society stable. Your influence on me has been noted and found concerning by those who value tradition above all else." "What does that mean for us?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means your second wish may be the most important decision either of us ever makes," he replied. "The council will arrive within the month to investigate my recent actions and determine whether I remain suitable for leadership. If they decide I have been compromised by mortal influence, they will remove me from power and ensure that influence can never affect vampire society again." The threat hung in the air between them, like a sword suspended by a thread. Elira understood that her very existence had become a challenge to forces much larger and more dangerous than anything she had previously imagined. The magical bond that connected them had created ripples that were spreading far beyond the walls of Castle Ravencrest. "What would happen to me if they remove you from power?" she asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. "They would consider you a dangerous precedent," he said quietly. "A mortal who influenced vampire leadership could inspire others to believe such influence was possible. They would ensure no one could follow your example." The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a cloak made of stone, but beneath the fear came something unexpected: determination. Her mother's voice had spoken of strength grown in silence, of love that could transform even the most unlikely hearts. Perhaps the time had come to discover whether decades of quiet observation had taught her wisdom that could stand against centuries of vampire tradition. The mirror of truth hung in a chamber that Elira had never known existed, concealed behind a tapestry in Lord Castellan's private quarters. The enchanted looking glass stood nearly 7 feet tall, its silver surface reflecting not just physical appearance, but the deepest nature of whoever stood before it. When she gazed into its depths, she saw herself as she truly was, not just a servant, but a woman who had learned to find strength in silence and wisdom in observation. Lord Castellan had revealed the chamber's location during their most recent evening meeting, when the weight of the Vampire Council's impending arrival made secrets feel like luxuries they could no longer afford. The hidden room contained artifacts from his mortal life, carefully preserved but rarely examined, like relics from a religion he had abandoned but could not quite forget. His true name was Edmund Blackthorne, and he had been 28 when the transformation claimed his humanity. The chamber held a portrait painted during his final year of mortal life, showing a man whose eyes held warmth and idealism that had been slowly erased by centuries of necessary cruelty. A sword hung beside the painting, its blade still sharp despite being untouched for 400 years, inscribed with words that pledged service to justice and protection of the innocent. Books lined shelves along one wall, their pages filled with poetry he had written during quiet moments between battles. Elira read passages that spoke of love for the land he protected, hope for peace that never seemed to arrive, and dreams of a future where strength served compassion rather than conquest. The man who had written those words bore little resemblance to the vampire lord who had ruled Castle Ravencrest with cold efficiency for longer than most kingdoms had existed. "I kept these things as reminders," Edmund said as they stood together in the chamber that held his past. "But over the centuries, they became accusations instead. Every time I looked at them, I saw evidence of what I had chosen to sacrifice for the sake of survival." The mirror of truth showed him as he truly was. In that moment, neither fully vampire nor completely human, but something caught between two natures that had begun to war within his immortal flesh. The reflection revealed a man struggling with desires he had suppressed for centuries, compassion that threatened to overwhelm the cold calculation necessary for vampire leadership. Elira moved closer to the mirror, studying the way it revealed not just Edmund's internal conflict, but her own transformation since the night she had saved his life. The frightened girl who had arrived at the castle 33 years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to recognize her own worth even when others failed to see it. "The council will arrive in 2 weeks, Edmund said, his voice carrying resignation that bordered on despair. "They will examine every aspect of my rule, questioning servants and guards about changes in my behavior. They will discover our connection and demand explanations that I cannot provide without revealing the depth of what has occurred between us." "What kinds of explanations will they accept?" she asked, though part of her already understood that vampire society would find no justification sufficient for their lord's growing humanity. "None," he replied simply. "They will see my transformation as weakness, proof that mortal influence can corrupt even the strongest vampire bloodlines. The punishment for such corruption is removal from power, followed by the elimination of the corrupting influence to prevent similar incidents in the future." The threat was clear, but instead of fear, Elira felt something entirely unexpected, protective anger on behalf of the man whose humanity was being treated as a disease requiring cure. Edmund had ruled fairly for centuries, maintaining the delicate balance between vampire society and the mortal world with wisdom and restraint. The council's concerns seemed to stem not from any failure of leadership, but from their fear that compassion might spread like infection through their ranks. "What if we could prove that your transformation strengthened rather than weakened your ability to rule?" she suggested, the words surprising her as much as they surprised him. "What if we could demonstrate that understanding both sides of your nature made you more effective, not less?" He stared at her with an expression that cycled through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been admiration. "You would be willing to stand before the Vampire Council and argue for my fitness to rule, knowing that failure would mean certain death for both of us?" "I have spent 33 years watching you govern this territory," she replied with growing confidence. "I have seen you make decisions that balance justice with mercy, strength with wisdom, tradition with adaptation to changing circumstances. If the council cannot recognize the value of a leader who understands both vampire nature and human emotion, then perhaps they are the ones who have lost sight of what true leadership requires." The mirror of truth reflected her words back with added power, showing not just her determination, but the rightness of her position. Edmund stared at their shared reflection, seeing perhaps for the first time how their connection had transformed them both in ways that made them stronger rather than weaker. Other servants had begun to whisper about the changes spreading through Castle Ravencrest. Helena mentioned that the vampire lord's meals had grown more elaborate, as if he were rediscovering the pleasure of taste rather than simply consuming sustenance. Marcus reported that Edmund had begun walking through the gardens during twilight hours, showing interest in flowers and growing things that had previously held no meaning for him. Thomas observed that his master's decisions regarding security and territorial management had become more nuanced, incorporating concern for both vampire interests and human welfare in ways that produced better outcomes for everyone involved. Rather than ruling through fear and intimidation, Edmund had begun employing strategies that encouraged cooperation and mutual benefit. Aldrich's research had uncovered ancient texts suggesting that vampire transformation need not be permanent, that under specific circumstances involving genuine love and willing sacrifice, the curse could be modified or even reversed. These texts spoke of vampire lords who had chosen mortality to protect those they cared about, trading immortal power for the deeper satisfactions of human connection. But such transformation required not just personal desire, but external validation, recognition from vampire society that the choice served greater purposes than mere self-gratification. The council would need to be convinced that Edmund's growing humanity represented evolution rather than corruption, progress rather than regression. "Your second wish becomes crucial," Edmund said as they prepared to leave the Chamber of Hidden Memories. "It could provide the evidence we need to demonstrate that our connection serves purposes larger than personal satisfaction. But it could also seal our fate if the Council interprets it as further proof of dangerous mortal influence." Elira looked once more into the mirror of truth, seeing not just who she was, but who she might become if she found the courage to trust the wisdom her mother's spirit had recognized within her. The frightened servant girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes love required not submission, but the willingness to fight for what mattered most. "I know what my second wish will be," she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "But I want to make it in front of the council, so they can witness the truth of what exists between us and decide for themselves whether love strengthens or weakens those it touches." The dagger of covenant breaking lay hidden beneath centuries of dust in the castle's deepest vault, its blade forged from metal that existed nowhere else in the mortal world. Elira had never seen the weapon before, but when Aldrich led her and Edmund into the chamber where it rested, she felt its power resonate through her blood like a tuning fork struck against stone. The dagger could sever any magical bond, break any supernatural curse, and free any soul held captive by forces beyond mortal understanding. The Vampire Council arrived at sunset on the appointed day, their presence announced by the sudden temperature drop that preceded their approach. 5 ancient vampires materialized from shadow and mist, each one old enough to remember the rise and fall of empires. They moved with fluid grace that made Edmund's own supernatural speed seem clumsy by comparison, and their eyes held depths that spoke of centuries spent in darkness that had never known the touch of human warmth. Councillor Morgaine took the lead, her silver hair flowing like liquid moonlight around a face that had remained unchanged for over 1,000 years. She wore authority like armor, her voice carrying the weight of absolute power when she addressed Edmund in the great hall, where the blood chalice of binding reflected their gathering like captured starlight. "Lord Castellan," she said, using his title rather than his true name, in a calculated demonstration of distance. "We have received reports of concerning changes in your behavior, alterations in your governance that suggest possible compromise by mortal influence. The Council requires explanation and demonstration of your continued fitness for leadership." Edmund stood before them with dignity intact, though Elira could see tension gathering in his shoulders as he prepared to defend decisions that had been influenced by emotions vampire society considered weakness. She remained in the shadows at the hall's edge, her presence acknowledged but not yet addressed, like a piece of evidence waiting to be examined. "I have governed this territory for 4 centuries without significant incident," Edmund replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what was at stake. "Trade routes remain secure, mortal populations stay within acceptable bounds, and tribute flows to the council treasury as required by vampire law. My methods may have evolved, but my results speak for themselves." Councillor Vex, whose appearance suggested eternal youth corrupted by ancient malice, stepped forward with a smile that revealed fangs longer and sharper than Edmund's own. "Methods matter as much as results, Lord Castellan. We have reports of unusual behavior, daylight exposure that should be impossible, suspension of regular feeding schedules, and most concerning, emotional attachment to a human servant that violates the fundamental principles governing vampire-mortal relationships. The servant in question saved my life during the solar ritual," Edmund said, gesturing toward Elira with careful formality. "Ancient law recognizes blood debt and grants magical compensation for such sacrifice. I am bound by forces older than this council to honor her service with wishes granted." Councillor Thane, whose scarred face spoke of battles fought before human civilization emerged from barbarism, studied Elira with eyes that seemed to see through flesh, to examine the Khan, soul beneath. When he spoke, his words carried undertones that made the very stones of the castle seem to shiver with anticipation. "Bring the mortal forward," he commanded. "We would examine this creature who claims to have influenced one of our most powerful lords." Elira stepped into the circle of candlelight that surrounded the blood chalice. Her simple dress, a stark contrast to the elaborate robes worn by the council members. But she held her head high, drawing strength from her mother's memory and from the knowledge that Edmund believed in her courage, even if she sometimes doubted it herself. "State your name and lineage," Morgaine ordered, her voice carrying compulsion that tried to force absolute honesty from Elira's lips. "My name is Elira," she replied, feeling the magical pressure but resisting the urge to elaborate beyond what was required. "My mother was Liana, a seamstress in the village below this castle." Thane moved closer, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Something changed in his expression as he examined her features, a recognition that seemed to surprise him as much as it concerned the other council members. "Liana," he repeated slowly, as if the name carried significance that others had missed. "Describe your mother's appearance, hair color, eye shape, any distinctive markings or characteristics that might identify her bloodline." Elira felt unease growing in her stomach, but she answered truthfully. She had dark hair with silver threads, green eyes that seemed to see more than others could perceive, and a birthmark on her left wrist shaped like a crescent moon. She possessed unusual knowledge of herbs and healing, and she could sometimes sense things that had not yet happened. The council exchanged glances that carried meanings Elira could not interpret, but their sudden tension suggested her words had revealed something they had not expected to discover. Morgaine approached the blood chalice and began speaking in the ancient language, used for the most serious vampire rituals, calling upon forces that could reveal truth hidden by time and deception. The chalice filled with liquid that seemed to capture starlight, its surface showing images that flickered and changed, like memories given physical form. Elira saw her mother as a young woman, but the woman in the vision wore robes that marked her as someone of significance, rather than a simple village seamstress. She stood in chambers Elira had never seen, speaking with figures whose faces remained shadowed, but whose power was unmistakable. "Your mother was not a seamstress," Vex said, his voice carrying accusation that struck Elira like a physical blow. "She was Liana Nightwhisper, last surviving member of the witch bloodline responsible for the original vampire curse. Her ancestors created the magic that transformed mortals into our kind, and her descendants carry the power to modify or destroy what was made." The revelation hit Elira like lightning, recontextualizing everything she had believed about her origins and her place in the world. Her mother had been not just a loving parent but a guardian of ancient secrets, a keeper of knowledge that could reshape vampire society itself. The lullabies that had comforted her childhood had been spells in disguise, planting seeds of power that would bloom when the time was right. "The 3 wishes were not random magic," Thane continued, his scarred face showing a mixture of respect and wariness. "They were prophesied by your ancestor who created the vampire curse in the first place. She foresaw a time when her bloodline would have the opportunity to choose whether vampires remained bound to darkness or could find their way back to light." Edmund stared at Elira with an expression of shock that mirrored her own feelings of disorientation. The magical bond between them suddenly made sense in ways that went far beyond simple blood debt or mutual attraction. They were connected by forces that had been set in motion centuries before either of them was born, part of a destiny that had been waiting for the right moment to unfold. "Your second wish becomes more than personal choice," Morgaine said, her voice carrying warning that seemed to echo from the very walls of the castle. "It represents a decision that could affect every vampire in existence." You have the power to either strengthen the bonds that tie us to our immortal nature, or to break the curse entirely, allowing us to choose mortal life if we so desire. But such power comes with responsibility, Councillor Erebus added, speaking for the first time since their arrival. His voice was like autumn leaves falling into forgotten graves, carrying the weight of eternal loneliness. Choose wrongly, and you will destroy the careful balance that has allowed vampire society to exist for millennia. Choose wisely, and you might give us something we lost so long ago we had forgotten it was possible, the freedom to determine our own fates. Elira looked at Edmund, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of fear and hope that she felt growing in her own heart. Her second wish would not just determine their personal future, but the destiny of an entire supernatural race. The quiet slave maiden who had spent decades invisible in shadows suddenly held the power to reshape the world in ways she was only beginning to understand. The dagger of covenant breaking seemed to pulse with anticipation in its hidden chamber, waiting to discover whether it would be used to preserve ancient bonds or to cut them forever, freeing immortal souls to choose their own paths, regardless of the curse that had defined them for centuries beyond memory. The hearthstone of mortal bonds rested in Edmund's palm like captured sunlight, its warm glow pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat, despite the fact that vampires were not supposed to possess such rhythms. Elira had never seen the stone before, but she understood instinctively that it represented something precious and dangerous, the connection between human love and immortal existence that had been growing stronger since the night she saved his life. 3 days had passed since the council's revelation about her bloodline, and the castle had transformed into a place of preparation and mounting tension. The Vampire Council remained as guests, but their presence felt more like occupation as they observed every interaction between Elira and Edmund, cataloguing evidence they would use to support whatever judgment they ultimately rendered. Aldrich had emerged from his library carrying texts that documented the original curse, ancient volumes that revealed the true story of how vampire society had begun. The witch who created the transformation had not intended it as a gift, but as a punishment for knights who had betrayed their oaths to protect the innocent. She had bound them to darkness as penance for choosing power over service, immortality over honor. But the curse had included a provision that her own descendants might one day choose to modify a back door built into the magic that would allow vampires to reclaim their humanity if they proved worthy of redemption. The 3 wishes granted to Elira were not random magic, but the key to that ancient lock, the mechanism by which centuries of supernatural bondage might finally be broken. Edmund stood at his chamber window, staring at the dawn sky that painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. By all rights, the approaching sunlight should have forced him to seek shelter in the castle's deepest chambers, but his transformation continued to accelerate in ways that defied vampire law. He could tolerate increasing levels of illumination, as if his growing connection to humanity was providing protection against the very forces that had once defined his existence. "The council grows more concerned with each passing hour," he said without turning from the window. "They can sense the change occurring within me, and they fear what it might mean for vampire society if others begin to experience similar transformations." Elira joined him at the window, no longer maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their relationship for 3 decades. The magical bond between them had evolved beyond master and servant, beyond even the connection that might exist between lovers, into something that transcended normal categories of human emotion. "Councillor Thane questioned me again this morning," she said, remembering the intensity of his examination and the way his ancient eyes had seemed to look through her physical form to study the power that flowed in her blood. "He wanted to know if I understood the magnitude of what my second wish might accomplish, whether I grasped the responsibility that comes with the ability to reshape supernatural law." "And what did you tell him?" That I understood responsibility because I had spent my entire life watching someone else exercise it wisely, she replied, touching the hearthstone that lay warm against his chest. I told him that you had ruled for 4 centuries with justice and compassion, balancing the needs of vampire society with the welfare of mortal populations in ways that served everyone's interests. Edmund turned from the window to study her face, and she saw vulnerability in his expression that made her heart ache with protective tenderness. The vampire lord, who had commanded absolute authority for longer than most nations had existed, was genuinely afraid, not for his own safety, but for hers. "The council has offered me an alternative," he said quietly. "If I agree to undergo a ritual that will strengthen my bonds to vampire nature and eliminate the human emotions that have been growing within me, they will allow you to live. Your bloodline would be monitored but preserved, ensuring that future generations could never access the power to modify the line." Original curse. The proposal hit her like ice water, crystallizing her understanding of the choice they faced. The Vampire Council was offering Edmund a path that would preserve his position and protect her life, but at the cost of everything that had grown between them. He would return to the cold efficiency that had characterized his rule for centuries, and she would live knowing that the connection between them had been severed forever. "You cannot seriously be considering such an offer," she said, though part of her feared he might choose her survival over his own transformation. "I am considering every option that might keep you alive," he replied with honesty that made her want to weep. "Your second wish will determine not just our fate, but the destiny of every vampire in existence. If you choose to break the curse, some will welcome the opportunity to reclaim their humanity, but others will fight to preserve the power and immortality they have possessed for centuries." Den Rice's castle's other inhabitants had become unwilling participants in the drama unfolding around them. Helena continued preparing meals with mechanical precision, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who understood that the world she had known for 2 decades might be about to change forever. Marcus tended his gardens with unusual intensity, as if nurturing growing things might somehow influence the outcome of supernatural negotiations occurring beyond his understanding. Thomas maintained security protocols with military efficiency, but his men reported strange phenomena throughout the castle, shadows that moved independently of their sources, temperatures that fluctuated without apparent cause, and sounds that suggested the very stones were responding to the magical tensions building toward some inevitable climax. The Vampire Council had established themselves in chambers that allowed them to observe Edmund and Elira without seeming to spy, but their surveillance was constant and incomprehensive. Morgane had positioned herself where she could monitor the approaches to Edmund's quarters, while Vex claimed a tower that provided views of the gardens where they sometimes walked together. Thane remained in the Great Hall, studying ancient texts that might provide precedent for the situation they faced. During their evening meal, Councillor Erebus shared stories of other vampires who had attempted to reclaim their humanity over the centuries. Most had failed, destroyed by magic that refused to release its hold on their immortal souls. A few had succeeded partially, gaining the ability to tolerate sunlight or to experience human emotions, but none had achieved complete transformation back to mortal life. "Your bloodline represents something unprecedented," Erebus explained, as they sat around a table that had hosted similar councils for hundreds of years. Previous attempts at modification relied on external magic or supernatural artifacts, but your power comes from within, from the same source that created vampire nature in the first place. You have the potential to accomplish what others could only dream of achieving. "And if I choose to use that power," Elira asked, "what happens to vampires who do not wish to change? What becomes of those who prefer immortality to the uncertainties of mortal life?" "That would depend on the specific nature of your wish," Morgane replied with careful neutrality. Magic responds to intention as much as to words. If your goal is to provide choice rather than to force change, the curse could be modified to allow individual vampires to decide their own fate. But such nuanced magic requires tremendous precision and absolute clarity of purpose. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, but Elira drew strength from the memory of her mother's voice during that supernatural ritual weeks ago. Liana had spoken of love that could transform even the most unlikely hearts, of strength that grew in silence, and of futures filled with possibilities that previous generations had never dared imagine. Edmund took her hand as they prepared to retire for what might be their final evening together before the council demanded her decision. His fingers intertwined with hers in a gesture that would have been impossible when their relationship was defined by hierarchy and servitude, but which now felt as natural as breathing. "Whatever you choose tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying emotions that 4 centuries of vampire existence had not entirely erased. "Know that you have already given me something I thought was lost forever. You have reminded me what it feels like to care for someone else's welfare more than my own survival." She squeezed his hand, drawing courage from the connection that had transformed them, both in ways that reached far beyond the magical bond, compelling her wishes. Tomorrow she would make a choice that could reshape supernatural society, but tonight she simply wanted to hold onto the love that had made such transformation possible. The hearthstone pulsed between them, its warm light a reminder that some magic grew stronger when shared rather than hoarded, that some power increased rather than diminished when used in service of others. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, bound not by ancient curses or supernatural compulsion, but by the simple human truth that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price that fate might demand. The Sword of Dawn's light materialized in Edmund's hand as the vampire council surrounded them in the great hall, its blade forged from the first sunrise and capable of either destroying vampires completely or freeing them from the darkness that bound their souls. Elira had never seen him wield a weapon with such deadly purpose, but the threat facing them required responses that went beyond diplomatic negotiation. Councillor Morgaine had abandoned all pretense of civilized discourse, her ancient features twisted with rage that centuries of accumulated power might be threatened by a mortal woman's compassion. The other council members flanked her in a formation that blocked every exit from the hall, their supernatural speed making escape impossible, even if Edmund had been willing to abandon his responsibilities to the territory he had governed for 4 centuries. "You will make your second wish now," Morgaine commanded, her voice carrying compulsion backed by magical authority that predated human civilization. "And you will wish for the strengthening of vampire bonds, ensuring that no future generation can threaten the order we have maintained since the dawn of immortal society." Elira stood beside Edmund, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders like mountain stone, but also drawing strength from the love that had grown between them, despite every obstacle vampire law could place in their path. The blood chalice of binding reflected their gathering, like captured starlight, its surface showing images of possible futures that shifted and changed with each heartbeat. "I will not be compelled to make any wish that serves your fear rather than justice," Elira replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of forces arrayed against them. "The magic that grants these wishes responds to my will, not yours, and I choose to use it in service of freedom rather than continued bondage." Councillor Vex moved with fluid grace that made Edmund's own supernatural abilities seem sluggish by comparison, crossing the space between them faster than mortal eyes could follow. But the Sword of Dawn's light met his attack with precision, born of centuries of combat experience, its blade cutting through darkness itself to force the ancient vampire back with a scream of rage. "You would fight the entire council to protect this mortal's right to destroy everything we have built?" Thane demanded, his scarred face showing disbelief that any vampire would choose individual love over collective survival. I would fight anyone who threatens someone I have sworn to protect, Edmund replied, his voice carrying echoes of the night he had been before transformation claimed his humanity. That oath meant something when I was mortal, and it means something still. The battle erupted with violence that shook the very foundations of Castle Ravencrest, ancient magic clashing against weapons that predated recorded history. Edmund fought with skill that reminded everyone present why he had been chosen to rule this territory, but 5 council members possessed advantages that individual prowess could not overcome indefinitely. Councillor Erebus summoned shadows that moved like living things, reaching for Elira with tendrils of darkness that sought to drain the power from her blood before she could make her crucial wish. But the hearthstone of mortal bonds flared with protective light, its warmth creating barriers that supernatural malevolence could not penetrate. Thomas and his guards attempted to enter the Great Hall when the sounds of combat reached the castle's other levels, but magical barriers sealed every entrance, ensuring that this confrontation would be resolved without mortal interference. The Vampire Council intended to settle the question of Elira's wishes without witnesses who might carry tales to other territories. Helena and Marcus gathered the remaining servants in the kitchen, offering what comfort they could, while supernatural forces battled for control of their home's future. Aldrich remained in his library, consulting texts that might provide some advantage in the conflict above. But his scholarly knowledge seemed inadequate against the raw power being unleashed throughout the castle. Edmund parried attacks from multiple opponents simultaneously, the sword of dawn's light, leaving trails of golden radiance that illuminated the hall with brightness that should have been deadly to vampire flesh. But his growing humanity provided protection that pure, immortal nature could not match, allowing him to wield weapons of light without suffering the destruction that would have claimed him months earlier. Your transformation makes you weak, Morgane snarled as her claws raked across his shoulder, drawing blood that fell like crimson rain onto stones that had witnessed similar violence for centuries. Human emotion clouds your judgment, makes you vulnerable to attacks you would have easily avoided when darkness ruled your heart. My transformation makes me complete, Edmund replied, spinning to deflect Vex's follow-up strike while positioning himself between the council members and Elira. For 4 centuries, I have ruled through fear and cold calculation, but now I understand what true strength requires, the willingness to sacrifice everything for someone whose welfare matters more than your own survival. The magical energy building in the Great Hall reached levels that made the very air seem to vibrate with potential violence. Elira felt power flowing through her blood like liquid starlight, responding to the crisis by preparing to grant whatever wish she might make with force sufficient to reshape reality itself. But the Vampire Council's desperation had reached levels that made them willing to violate laws even older than the ones they claimed to protect. If they could not compel her cooperation, they would eliminate her before she could make any wish at all, ensuring that the power in her bloodline died with her and could never threaten vampire society again. The phoenix feather of renewal burst into golden flame in Elira's hand, its radiant plumage representing the power to transform curses into blessings, to change endings into beginnings, to reshape destiny itself, according to love rather than fear. The ancient artifact had been waiting in the castle's deepest vault for this moment, called forth by magic that recognized the arrival of its destined wielder. I make my second wish, Elira declared, her voice cutting through the chaos of battle like a blade forged from pure intention. The Vampire Council froze at her words, understanding that whatever she spoke next would reshape their existence in ways none of them could prevent or control. Edmund continued fighting despite wounds that would have felled lesser vampires, the sword of dawn's light, weaving patterns of protection around them, both as ancient magic gathered to fulfill her command. Blood flowed from cuts that healed almost as quickly as they were made, but each exchange weakened him while his opponents remained fresh through supernatural endurance. "I wish," Elira continued, raising the phoenix feather until its light filled the entire great hall with radiance that made shadows dance like living things, "that every vampire in existence may choose their own fate freely, to remain immortal if that brings them joy, or to reclaim their humanity if their hearts call them toward mortal life and mortal love." The wish struck the assembled vampires like lightning given form and purpose, its power flowing outward from Castle Ravencrest to touch every supernatural creature bound by the original curse. Across the kingdom and beyond, vampires suddenly felt chains they had never realized existed, beginning to loosen around their immortal souls. Councillor Morgane screamed as magic older than kingdoms swept through her ancient form, not destroying her immortal nature, but offering her something she had forgotten was possible: choice. For the first time in over 1,000 years, she could feel her own heartbeat, could sense the warmth of human emotion stirring beneath centuries of cold calculation. Vex staggered backward, his perpetual youth flickering between immortal perfection and the mortal age he had possessed before transformation. The curse no longer held him captive, but neither did it abandon him entirely. He could choose to remain as he had been for centuries, or he could allow time to reclaim the years he had stolen from death. Thane lowered his weapons, his scarred face showing wonder rather than rage, as power flowed through him like spring water, washing away winter's ice. The battles that had marked his flesh became badges of honor rather than reminders of supernatural violence, and he felt the peace he had sought for centuries finally within his reach. Erebus collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the return of emotions he had believed were permanently lost to vampire transformation. Joy, sorrow, hope, fear, all the complicated feelings that made mortal existence meaningful, flooded back into his consciousness like sunlight after endless night. Throughout the supernatural realm, vampires experienced similar revelations as Elira's wish took effect. Some chose immediately to remain immortal, finding comfort in the power and perspective that centuries of existence had provided. Others felt the pull of mortality calling them back to human experience, offering them the possibility of natural death, genuine love, and the precious fragility that made each moment meaningful. Edmund felt the change most powerfully of all, his own transformation accelerating as the magical bonds that had defined his existence for 4 centuries dissolved like morning mist before rising sun. He could choose to remain Lord Castellan, ruling his territory with the wisdom accumulated over centuries of governance, or he could become Edmund Blackthorn again, mortal, vulnerable, and capable of sharing a natural lifespan with the woman who had reminded him what love could accomplish. "The choice is yours," Elira said, approaching him as the phoenix feather's light began to fade, leaving them in the gentle illumination of candles that had somehow survived the supernatural battle. "You can remain as you have been, immortal and powerful, governing this territory for centuries yet to come. Or you can choose mortality, knowing that we would have only decades together instead of eternity." Edmund looked at the sword of dawn's light in his hand, its blade reflecting not just candlelight, but the possibilities that stretched before them like uncharted territories waiting to be explored. The weapon that had been forged to destroy vampires had instead become an instrument of liberation, offering freedom to choose rather than demanding surrender to fate. "I choose you," he said simply, allowing the sword to dissolve into particles of light that danced briefly in the air before fading forever. "I choose love over power, mortality over immortal loneliness, decades of genuine happiness over centuries of cold efficiency." The transformation was not instantaneous, but gradual, like watching winter give way to spring across mountain valleys. Edmund's supernatural pallor warmed to human coloring, his amber eyes softened to the brown they had been during his mortal youth, and his immortal perfection yielded to the slight imperfections that marked him as genuinely human. The Vampire Council watched in stunned silence as their former peer made his choice, understanding that their authority over him had ended the moment he embraced mortality. They would need to find new ways to govern territories previously ruled by those who chose human life over supernatural power. But rather than rage or despair, most felt something approaching relief. Elira's wish had not destroyed vampire society, but had freed it from the rigid hierarchies that had stifled growth and change for millennia. Those who chose to remain immortal could do so with renewed purpose, while those who preferred mortality could pursue that path without shame or punishment. The garden rose of new beginnings bloomed in soil that had never known such beauty, its petals unfurling in shades of gold and crimson that caught morning sunlight like captured joy. Elira knelt beside the flower bed she and Edmund had planted together in the castle's transformed courtyard, marveling at how life could flourish in places that had once known only shadow and servitude. 6 months had passed since her second wish reshaped vampire society, and Castle Ravencrest had become something unprecedented, a community where former immortals and mortal humans worked together as equals, building new relationships based on choice rather than compulsion. The rigid hierarchies that had governed supernatural society for centuries had given way to cooperation and mutual respect. Edmund's transformation to mortality had progressed gradually, allowing him to retain the wisdom accumulated over 4 centuries while regaining the capacity for human emotion and natural aging. Grey threads had begun appearing in his dark hair, and laugh lines had started forming around his eyes, changes that might have seemed like losses, but which he treasured as evidence of his return to genuine humanity. The Vampire Council had departed weeks ago, but not in defeat, disgrace. Morgane had chosen to remain immortal, but had embraced the emotional capacity that Elira's wish had restored to her. She spoke now of using her centuries of experience to guide younger vampires through the choices available to them, helping them understand that power could serve love as effectively as it had once served domination. Vex had surprised everyone by choosing mortality almost immediately, explaining that eternal youth had become a prison rather than a gift. He left Castle Ravencrest to seek out the family he had abandoned centuries ago, hoping to make amends for disappearances and betrayals that had shaped generations of his descendants. Thane remained immortal, but had laid down his weapons, dedicating his existence to protecting those who chose vulnerability over power. His scarred face had softened with the return of compassion, and he spoke of establishing sanctuaries where mortals and vampires could coexist without fear or exploitation. Erebus had chosen a path between immortality and mortality, using magic to slow his aging while retaining enough humanity to experience the full spectrum of mortal emotion. He planned to spend his extended lifespan studying the philosophical implications of choice, documenting how the transformation of vampire society might serve as a model for other supernatural communities. Helena had decided to remain at Castle Ravencrest, but as head administrator rather than servant, helping to manage the complex logistics of a community where former immortals were learning to function as mortals. Her organizational skills proved invaluable as they navigated questions that had never needed answers before. How do you provide healthcare for vampires choosing mortality? What happens to territories previously ruled by immortal lords? How do you integrate centuries-old vampires into mortal society? Marcus had expanded his gardens to include areas where both sun-loving and shade-preferring plants could thrive, creating spaces where vampires and humans could gather together regardless of their tolerance for daylight. His patient cultivation of growing things served as a metaphor for the careful nurturing required to build trust between communities that had been separated by fear for millennia. Thomas had established new security protocols that protected both mortal and immortal residents, without creating the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized vampire strongholds for centuries. His guards included both former vampires and mortal humans, working together to ensure that choice remained protected for everyone within their territory. Aldrich had emerged from his library to establish a school where human children and young vampires could learn together, sharing knowledge that bridged the gap between mortal experience and supernatural wisdom. His curriculum included practical skills alongside ancient history, preparing students for a future where the boundaries between mortal and immortal communities would be increasingly fluid. Elira had never made her third wish, discovering that the power remained available, but feeling no urgency to use it. The love that had grown between her and Edmund required no magical enhancement, and the transformation of vampire society had exceeded her most optimistic hopes. She kept the option in reserve, understanding that future challenges might require supernatural intervention, but finding joy in the ordinary magic of daily life, shared with someone she loved completely. Their wedding had taken place in the castle's great hall, witnessed by both mortal humans and vampires, who had chosen to celebrate love that transcended the ancient boundaries between their kinds. The ceremony had been simple but profound, emphasizing promises that would be kept through natural human lifespans rather than eternal supernatural existence. Edmund's former territories had been restructured to accommodate the new reality of vampire society. Some areas remained under immortal governance for vampires who preferred traditional authority structures, while others had transitioned to mortal leadership, with immortal advisors providing continuity and historical perspective. Trade agreements, diplomatic relationships, and legal frameworks all required renegotiation as the supernatural world adapted to unprecedented changes. In the evenings, when work was done and the castle settled into peaceful quiet, Elira and Edmund would walk through gardens where roses bloomed in defiance of ancient curses. They spoke of the future they would build together, decades rather than centuries, but filled with genuine connection and shared purpose. They planned to travel beyond the mountain valleys that had contained their entire relationship, exploring a world where their love story had become legend among both mortal and immortal communities. Sometimes, when twilight painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Elira would sing the lullabies her mother had taught her so many years ago. But now Edmund added his voice to hers, creating harmonies that spoke of love transcending death, hope surviving despair, and transformation that began with simple recognition of another's worth. The garden rose of new beginnings continued blooming throughout seasons that should have claimed its petals, a living symbol of love that had chosen to flourish in soil that had once known only shadow. And in that perpetual spring, two souls, who had found each other across centuries of separation, built a life together that proved some magic was worth any price, any sacrifice, any risk that fate might demand. Their story had become more than romance. It was evidence that even the most ancient curses could be transformed into blessings when love was brave enough to choose hope over fear, connection over isolation, and the precious fragility of mortal happiness over the cold perfection of immortal power.